What's good, everybody? This is Jason Webb, and this is Over Quota, where I interview founders, CEOs, sales leaders, and the top enterprise software salespeople about the keys to consistently exceeding expectations. Now, my goal for these interviews is to get something beyond what you might get from traditional sales coaching by hearing real people talk about how they've been able to drive real results consistently over time. And the guest that I have on here today, which I'll introduce in a second, will epitomize that. And really we'll get a lot out of him today, I promise. I should also mention that my company, the J. David Group, is sponsoring this episode and will sponsor all episodes until I get other sponsors. So I am open, by the way, for people who are listening that have some sort of sales applications or something that might be congruent and interesting to my audience. Please reach out. My company, however, helps growth software companies recruit top salespeople. So if you want to go to the jdavidgroup.com/hiring to learn more, we can schedule a call. So as I alluded to earlier, my guest today is Clayton LiaBraaten, the CRO of Pure Integration, and we'll get more about them in a minute, but the quick summary is their operational process design experts help companies leverage technology to help them save time and cut costs. Clayton, welcome to Over Quota.
Hey, Jay, thanks for the introduction. Happy to join you today and look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So let's just start there. Talk to me a little bit about your role at Pure Integration and how Pure Integration helps their companies, their customers.
So Pure Integration was founded about 15 years ago by some folks that came out of the Big Four, Big Six consulting world. And we're focused initially on communication service providers. So you've got a target-rich environment of systems and processes. You can imagine at a company like a Comcast or Charter or the large wireless operators, everything from customer acquisition through customer retention, all of the network operations processes. So a never-ending continuous improvement process. And where we fit at Pure Integration is really along that continuum from the front-end consulting and assessments and recommendations all the way through execution and delivery on those projects. And we are a technology company, but I would say that first and foremost, we have a high degree of business acumen and understand those needs. And then we leverage the tools and platforms that can enable success on behalf of our clients. And so while our pedigree includes the largest communication service providers in North America, we have also been expanding, and they brought me in to help with that expansion, both within the existing marquee accounts and in the communication service provider vertical. But beyond that, to leverage the experience we have there into new industries, new logos that are experiencing the same problems. And I would summarize what we do as really digital transformation, consulting, and delivery.
And just to put that into a little added context, so I'm a big fan of automation, frankly, and machine learning and those types of things. So let's say, for instance, if I wanted to, let's say I start to automate my particular business in terms of outreach and developing candidates and building candidate pipeline. And I know that, for instance, like IBM Watson or some sort of machine learning or AI tools are out there, but yet I don't really know how to implement that into my business. I know that's what I want to do, but I don't really know how to get from point A to point B. Is that something that Pure Integration would help me with?
Absolutely. So I think that's a classic example of, we know what the design goal is, right, on the right end of that spectrum. Mm-hmm. But before we get there, do we understand the data sources? Have we optimized those? Have we looked at the existing processes and decided which we want to carry forward and which we potentially want to replace? Automation is a good example because when we talk about robotic process automation or intelligent automation, I've had executives come to me and say, look, we have 400 processes that we want to automate. Can you help us? And the first question that I ask is, are you sure you want to do that? Now, you have to have the right relationship with those executives to say that, right? But really what you want us to do is to come in and assess those and say, of those 400, we actually think maybe only 120 of them are really candidates for automation, and this is why. And so from a sales perspective, Number one, I have to have the rapport to be able to ask that question. Maybe you're not thinking about this exactly right. And number two, I need to realize that it would be great just to close a deal for 400 processes, but I will build a much better relationship, and my team will build better relationships when they have that type of consultative conversation with the buyers to say, let us work through this with you. Another example that we see that with is in cloud. Everybody wants to get into the cloud, or so they think. And so we have two different types of customers there that the sales team is working with. One are folks who are already in the cloud, and I wouldn't say they're having second thoughts, but they want to reevaluate. Maybe they threw everything over the wall to an AWS or Azure or GCP, and they want us to come in and kind of recalibrate and determine maybe there's a progressive cloud or hybrid cloud model that would make more sense, because either cost overruns or data sensitivity. Then we've got customers who are just at the beginning of their journey. What should I do in the cloud? And that's a good time to engage us. And again, we'll come up with a consulting engagement and a set of deliverables. After that consulting engagement, the customer can then elect to wash their hands of us or ask us to deliver that. And I think in the context of this conversation, Jay, it's not every salesperson can actually run that full cycle, right? In my particular case, I am not looking for transactional salespeople, for example. Those folks do exist for a reason, right? And there are plenty of opportunities for them to succeed. But in a business like ours, I don't need people who are good at simply positioning boxes, for example. I need people who are going to engage.
And let's start there, because you mentioned one of the questions that you might ask people is, are you sure you want to consider all 400 of those and those types of questions? And you mentioned the fact that, the rapport that you have with the prospect is obviously important, and that you're looking really for strategic and consultative salespeople. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about, just looking at the breadth of your career, what you've found has separated the right people, right? Let's say the top salespeople from the people that really get stuck and aren't necessarily hitting their quota or even coming close.
So, boy, that's a really open-ended question, but I think that when I look for, I look for the intangibles. Everybody's going to show up and they're going to give me all their W-2s and their President's Club awards and all of that kind of stuff, and I'm very impressed by that, right? But what I'm really interested in is certain characteristics that take a little bit different interviewing process, right? So what are they curious? I consider sales to be an intellectual pursuit. And what I mean by that is, are they people who are not only capable, but genuinely interested in understanding the markets, understanding industries, diving into their customers, what their customers' initiatives are, what their competitive threats are. And then I need them to be creative and resourceful as well, so that they're constantly thinking through and forging solutions that will end up in a win-win. And those are the types of people that not only can find opportunity, sometimes where none exists, but they can recover from crises and they can build long-term relationships. And certainly that's what I'm interested in. We talk about land and expand. A good hunter who has a consultative bent is able to not only kick doors in, but clean up the mess after themselves and then continue pursuits within that account while simultaneously looking for the next logo or the next buyer.
You mentioned curiosity and resourcefulness, right? And to be creative and to really dig into the prospects business, I presume, and what are some of the challenges that they have and all that. Is there a way, and I'm curious just from my own perspective, right? Is there a way to tease that out as you're evaluating candidates and to vet that to get an understanding of, how curious, does this person exhibit these traits, being curious, being curious, being resourceful? How do you actually get that if you're sitting down and maybe even evaluating your current team or people that might be coming on your team?
Sure. I mean, first of all, there's some canned questions that do elicit a response, right? So, asking about, what are the most complex problems you have ever solved, and please, tee up for me both the business and the technical aspects of that, right?
Mm.
And then drilling into that, I might say, well, were there change management implications along the way? And the reason I asked that question is because it generally teases out whether they were simply positioning a tool or a platform or a solution, or they were integrating with the organization, thinking through things like adoption and all of the itinerant issues that crop up whenever you're going to implement a new piece of software. I mean, what's ironic is the other thing I hear from executives in all of these different enterprises, both on the technology and business side, is that, hey, Clayton, we've actually acquired and implemented, over 75 different platforms, and we need to rationalize them, not only from a cost perspective, but from a usage perspective. Can you help us? So asking the change management question is good. Asking them, obviously, where have you succeeded in and failed in terms of positioning sophisticated solutions it is also a good way. But I like to get salespeople extemporizing, as the case would be, right? So just asking them a question like, you tell me, what do you think are the most critical components of digital transformation, right? Buzzword, right? But very topical, and understanding how they are able to articulate their position on it, assuming they have one, shows me a couple of things, right? What are they relevant? And are they interested in remaining relevant and really kind of understanding where the market is going? I may also tell them, what do you think are the hottest trends and biggest gaps over the next decade? Not just some fly-by-night solution that happens to be the flavor of the day, like Y2K, but what are the durable issues that we're going to face as we're digitizing, and as we're modernizing? And where do you think, where have you played, or where do you think you'd be interested in playing? Again, not all of those answers will be pertinent to my role here at Pure Integration, but they give me a good sense of that person and as to whether or not they're the kind of person who gets up, watches CNBC, reads the Wall Street Journal, reads some trade magazines. Those are not necessarily, the ultimate criteria for a good salesperson, but they come into an overlay to the performance metrics that you're going to see from Rainmakers.
If somebody walks in the door without those, right? In other words, it's evident that they're not curious or that they're not resourceful. But let's just say they apparently, right? It's always hard to prove, but apparently they've overachieved. Maybe they've come from, good company, or at least maybe even a relevant company for that matter. Is that, without those traits, because they are so paramount to you, are those, if they don't have them, is that a non-starter, number one? Number two is, let's say, for instance, if you have folks that you're evaluating, and let's say, for instance, they've been part of your team in the past or now, is there anything you can do to enable those behaviors, to sort of pull those out, or is it just something that's innate that, you can't really, how are you going to put curiosity into somebody, or make them be more resourceful when they're, not necessarily exhibiting those types of things? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess a couple thoughts. First of all, this reminds me of a debate between, what is management versus leadership, and can you train leadership? You can teach management. And that's not the purpose of this call. Yeah. Love to talk about that stuff. But in terms of the role I'm in now, right? I would say that it's almost a deal stopper if they don't bring that in the door. Now, right now, I'm trying to, I'm hiring more seasoned people, and I'm, there are people who have either established good or bad habits for the most part, and I don't really have time necessarily to develop and mentor those skills. However, in other roles that I have had, I have used tools like trying to ensure that there's a lot of collaborative, build a collaborative environment. I use tools like Yammer, for example, where I post articles that are related to our customers or to digital transformation or business or leadership, and try to inculcate that culture of continuous learning, right? I do believe most people are interested in learning. I don't think, if somebody comes through the door and they're the type of salesperson who just has a picture of Maui on their refrigerator, and a Maserati, that may not be someone that's their experience may not resonate with me. But if I were in a larger organization, the other thing I look for, and even here, teamwork, right? Is what can they demonstrate how they have collaborated with their sales or solutions engineering groups, right? How do they in other words, asking specific questions about how you navigate an account and prosecute a sale are critically important to me, right? So even someone, there are no successful rogue salespeople. They may want to cowboy things, but ultimately the winners always leverage the internal talent, and they need to do that judiciously, because you've got a finite amount of sales engineers and product developers, but they need to always have a team selling approach in mind. And so when I talk to them, I want to understand, how have you leveraged sales engineers? How have you leveraged your product people? How have you leveraged project managers? Those are all really important to that entire cycle. In a larger company, and I've struggled when I've been in more entrepreneurial or smaller to mid-sized companies, bringing people in from the mega vendors, because they have so much horsepower behind them, right? Number one, they have a brand. If I say I'm from Oracle or IBM, or these days, Workday or ServiceNow, I'm going to get a meeting. Salesforce, I will get the meeting because I've got the power of the brand. Then I've got a whole team who's prepared collateral for me, maybe an inside sales team who's prepared those. And so understanding how they integrated into those teams is critically important to me. But I tend to gravitate towards sales people who are more entrepreneurial in nature, a little bit more agile, and able to, again, run that cycle independently, but accessing the rest of the talent in the organization on an as-needed basis. And so it's been interesting, because I've hired people that came out of really good sales training programs like IBM, for example. And their fundamentals are just remarkable. But once they settle into the role, they do tend to struggle a bit, because they have to do, they're the ones who are ultimately modifying their decks. They're much more self-service oriented if they're going to be successful with me.
Right. It's interesting, right? Because you're on one hand, you want people that are resourceful enough, like you just mentioned before, but not, and you want people that are comfortable and can leverage their teammates to drive a sale forward. But at the same time, you don't want them to, I guess you don't want them to be too reliant on other people, and you don't want them to be too insular either at the same time, where, they're doing things in isolation where they could actually get something done faster, better, and their own, inability to do that could be a detriment to the organization or detriment to your sales team.
Yeah, and so if they have these dependencies on the rest of the ecosystem, sometimes it's really hard to help them understand that there's a little bit more self-determination in certain roles. Now, that's not to say I haven't had successful people come out of those big logos, because I have, but they come to me, it may be a different life stage, or they're very easily able to articulate why they want to come to a smaller, more nimble company. And it can't be just to make money, or just because I didn't like the bureaucracy. It's got, usually it has to be with somebody who really truly has that consultative DNA, that they're a problem solver, right? And some of the most successful people, and I'm biased because this is myself, I didn't start out in sales, right? I started out, my first civilian jobs were in general management and operations, network operations, contact center operations, those types of things, until eventually, the sales team was coming to me all the time because I could put a few sentences together, right? And I started looking across the aisle and saying, hey, these guys, they're doing pretty well. Maybe I should be more than just an internal advisor to them. And so I do people who come that have that innate problem solving, almost mechanic-like attitude have worked well with me for certain. And I think, if you're looking for, we're a services organization. And so our bread and butter is projects that get fantastic client reviews, and they buy more from us or recommend them to other buying centers in the account. And that means that we've got to have, not only presentable salespeople, but people who can go toe to toe with both their supporters and their detractors, right, at the account. And that's a tough thing to do in an interview. There's no question. And I have, like any sales leader, I've made some bad hires and I've made some brilliant hires. But we have to get away from simply looking at salespeople in a quantitative fashion. And that's why I believe that a more Socratic interviewing process is going to give us a good sense of who's sitting on the other side of the desk. Do you trust them to be an ambassador of your company? And do you trust them to be communicative about the reality of the situation, right? I've got two mantras, more than two. No unnecessary surprises, right? And bad news is better than no news, right? So is it somebody that's going to come in there and give that to me? And then, there's all the cultural implications. But increasingly, salespeople are very autonomous. It's very rare, because of the nature of what they do, that they're going to be in the office much, right? So these have to be people that you believe are going to be self-reliant. They're not going to be high maintenance, but they're going to escalate when they need to. And that takes more than one interview to get to the bottom of.
You mentioned, it would be better to be more Socratic than to look at, just transactionally, I guess, and their performance and data and things like that, which leads me to another question, which is, under what circumstances do you give almost like leniency, I guess, if you will, or room for, if you're sitting across from somebody or talking to somebody for the first time and they've told you that, speaking of honesty, that they struggled to meet their quota the last quarter or two, whatever the circumstance might be, and everybody has their own individual story. How do you evaluate that in particular situation? Like when you hear that, and then also from a candidate's perspective, how should they address, how should they address that? How should they handle underperformance, even though they're confident that they can do the job?
So great question. And I think that, so my coaching to candidates would be, don't come to somebody like me and blame your old boss. That just doesn't work, right? Or tell me something was, that the quota was unattainable. I think when each of my kids reached the age of about 3, I made them strike the phrase, "it's not fair," out of their vernacular, right? So with salespeople, it's like, I don't want to hear about your unattainable quota. I don't want to hear about your bad boss. But what I am interested in, so let me take a little bit of diversion. I have had teams, underperforming teams, who have survived very lean years by having exquisite knowledge of their prospects and customers. Meaning, if they had all the intelligence and said, these customers are under contract until next year, this is the competitive situation at this account, the capital budget collapsed over here, right? If I can get a picture of why we're failing, all right, at a composite view, then I can understand that, right? And now I'm challenged to try to help them as an organization, as a sales leader, overcome that, right? Either in terms of opening up their territories and finding new opportunities for them, or wallowing through a down cycle, believing that team is the best capable team of recovering when that comes. And so I would say that's the kind of an explanation I would like to hear from a professional salesperson who was going to interview with me, is that these are the dynamics that led to that failure. And there's a degree of self-deprecation that can also be really valuable. This is, what would you have done? What would you have done different, Jay, at the beginning of that year, when at the end of the year you found that all of your customers were under contract or there was no budget? If there are no good answers to that, right, I can't help you, right? If you didn't, salespeople, some salespeople tend to gravitate towards sales velocity, right? So they just want to get the deal as fast as they can because they know time kills all deals and they're hungry. But we also need them to be looking, that over the horizon radar to say, look, this particular opportunity is going to sunset in the account at X time. This is how I'm going to either get to the next opportunity horizontally, work a portfolio across the organization, or I better find the next customer that looks like this. So it's a long-winded way of answering your question to just say, guys, when you're interviewing, don't blame anybody else, right? Take accountability for your piece of it, what you could have done differently, and then articulate to me, again, the dynamics around that situation, market dynamics, territory dynamics, and I can glean a lot from that type of a dialogue.
I would imagine your answer wouldn't necessarily change if, to that question, if I say someone comes to me and says that their territory went from 400 accounts to 80 accounts in the span of a year or 18 months or something like that, which was a real life example recently of a candidate that I had, and therefore he was not able to, and by the way, his quota went up, and he was not able to maintain the level of success that he had previously. Would your answer stay the same, or would
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think so there's a difference between saying, I didn't have anything to sell. The company, the product was archaic. The product didn't work, and saying, look, this is what happens from an organizational standpoint. Now, what I would say is if you worked for an organization where they routinely doubled the quota and cut your territory in half, right, to drive the behavior, then help me understand that. And from, again, coaching candidates, I would say, maybe you should look at it and say, I do understand why they do this, right? I do understand why sales leadership did this, because they wanted to constantly drive that exceed quota performance, and they didn't want anybody to get fat. And so I do understand that. In that case, though, make sure that you come, you're coming with a full clip to explain to me, or somebody like me, exactly what happened there, right? And never play the victim in sales. That interview will last about 11 minutes, right? Because you're not a victim, and it doesn't play well. Unfair things happen in business, no doubt. I've had it happen to me. I've had companies sold out from under me when I was in the middle of growing them. I've done lots of different things that I didn't anticipate, and these are lessons learned. But if you play the victim, then I'm not exactly sure how you're going to go toe-to-toe with procurement people, who are ultimately going to see the end of that deal and tell you to sharpen your pencil and make all kinds of threats. I need folks that can navigate that as well, right? They've got to have the agility and the self-confidence to work through that. And if every job ends with blaming the system, that's unattractive in a candidate.
Couple of questions that I want to follow up on with that, which is that as a sales leader, especially now as the CRO at Pure Integration, if there's a number coming from leadership or the board that says, we need to grow by X, or we need to hit this revenue number, and you're looking at your existing pipeline, and that pipeline doesn't necessarily add up with what company expectations are, and you have your sales team and individual salespeople and sales quotas, and they don't add up. And maybe you're sitting down and you're going over your QBRs with your salespeople. How do you put that all together? How do you manage up and manage down at the same time, so that you're putting a number in front of your people that is stretched enough so that they're driving the results that you want to see, but at the same time, that maybe you're not necessarily going to hit the overall number because the alternative, I guess, would be to put out a number in front of them that's just completely unreasonable, and then they're sitting across from somebody else saying my quota was unreasonable, right? And they're interviewing somebody else. Like, how do you manage all that?
Great question. Just went through that, right? I'm relatively new in this role now. I make sure that the roles that I'm in give me influence over a bottoms-up forecast. So rather than just inheriting, some ridiculous number or some notional number, trying to strike a balance between what that corporate stretch goal is and a bottoms-up saying this is realistically what we deliver. Now, as I assign quotas to build to a revenue target, right? I owe that team. So I'm asking them, I'm putting aspirational goals in front of them. And of course you build accelerators that give them, realistic hope that if they match their historical performance individually, from wherever they came, as well as at a corporate level, that they can really make real money, and it's realistic. We can get, let's say it's 80% of whatever 80 to 85% of what the corporation is looking for. More than that is a tough gap to close, frankly, and I think that sales leaders need to be more assertive in terms of trying to manage those expectations. But what I owe that team in the QBRs and in our cadence calls and reviews, and even ad hoc, is how can I, as a sales leader and the organization, support them to grow the pipeline, right? So that they can, how are they going to, what are we going to do from a marketing and PR perspective, from an offerings and solutions and practices perspective as a services company, to make sure that they have all of the ammunition that they need to go on the offensive. And, that has to be constantly communicated. We're investing in marketing. We're investing in campaigns. We're taking feedback from the salespeople, the boots on the ground, to think about how we're going to position ourselves. What are the next generation solutions we're going to position? And what I've found is that when I partner with the field to make sure that they are as best equipped as possible to differentiate and win, never do it based on price, because that's a race to the bottom, then I get that confidence from my team that I'm working with operations, that I'm working, with the executive team to ensure that the expectation is not made in a vacuum. And, nothing should be a surprise by the time we get to a QBR, because, people who work for me endure a biweekly cadence call. Right, and that cadence call really, it's not putting people under a microscope, and it's not second guessing the salespeople. It's giving them an opportunity to walk me through their portfolio of opportunities. What's your pipeline? What's your forecast? And getting that routinized to a point, using your CRM, using your reports, so that's the first 20 minutes of a 45-minute to an hour-long call. And the rest of it is putting our heads together to understand, how can I help you? What shoulder? How can I be your blocking back, right, to get you over the goal line? And, so the salespeople that, it's basically parental guidance, right? It's like, clean your room, be on time, right? Do all of those things. And then we'll get to the fun stuff, which is how am I going to help you make money, which of course helps me make money and helps our company grow. It's really important that people have to sign up for those quotas, and they understand, the consequences of missing those quotas. But that, again, there's no surprises when you put these processes in place that you're checking people's temperature all the time. But I'd much rather have a conversation with you that says, hey, Jay, it's May, and you're like 27% of your way to forecast. Let's map out the rest of the year. Let's take out June, because that's when people are graduating and going to wedding. Let's figure it out together. Your salespeople are very engaged because they know you're invested in their success. But what they need to bring to me, again, as candidates and new employees, is a willingness and maybe a leap of faith that there's a method to the madness between the targets and how we're going to equip you to sell.
I think something you just said a little bit ago would be, I think, exciting and almost, I guess, I don't know what the right word is, I guess relieving or whatever, you alluded to having all hands on deck when especially when, let's say, for instance, the company goals or forecast are maybe misaligned with what the individual salespeople might be getting. And you mentioned bringing to bear all internal resources and operations and marketing and stuff like that to make sure that the sales team and the salespeople feel that they are supported and that you're going to do everything from a leadership perspective to get them over that hump and to get them over the finish line, so to speak. Talk to me about, like, if you're taking over an underperforming sales organization, underperforming team, how quickly, or what are the indicators are you looking for to understand, yep, these are the wrong people, or this is the wrong system, right? This is like the wrong process. Like we have the wrong, organization, I guess, if you will, in place. Like how do you evaluate that? And then within that, I guess, and this may be the same thing, but how do you discern and manage underperforming people, right? You have people in the team that just they haven't been able to get there. How do you get them there, or can you get them there?
So sometimes, I mean, I think that sales methodology, is important, but I think it gets a little bit too much press. I think that most sophisticated sales leaders have blended a number of methodologies that they've learned over the years with their own experience, and created something that they believe is effective. And it depends on what you're selling. Obviously, it's very different selling software and selling services and selling boxes, for example. The type of things that, obviously, I hope that I have historical information to kind of look at how each individual has performed and how they've performed within their accounts. I'm very interested in understanding how much of it has been renewals and extension, and how much of it has been net new. And then where it's net new, were they able to, expand there? I ask people to me, account planning is not only the key to understanding what your forecast is going to be, but understanding my entire company. So I believe in a very collaborative, but fairly structured account planning process, so that if I come into an organization, I'm going to expect the sales team to present to me what has historically happened in the account, and what are their plans for righting the ship. You mentioned a struggling organization, so showing an account plan that you believe in, that you can convince me, is again 80% of the way there. It's different when you've got an organization that's been harvesting and resting on their laurels. That comes out in the numbers fairly quickly. So between account planning and then the next stage of that, which is I'm going to talk to the clients, right? I'm going to make sure that I'm interviewing the buyers and the prospects and the clients, so that I can get firsthand understanding of how our company has been positioned and what the interactions with our folks have been. That is one of the best ways to determine whether people are fit into the right roles. And once we go through account planning and then have met some of those customers, then it's either I can put together a get well plan for that individual, or fairly rapidly, I don't want to say ruthlessly, but come to the determination that they're just not a fit for this company. And I've had to part with salespeople who have been very successful elsewhere, right? The success in a company can vary wildly depending on what's being sold and to whom. But again, to summarize, I would say that account planning and customer interviews are the best way to determine whether or not you can salvage what's there, or you got to rip and replace.
You mentioned methodology a little bit, and how it can be over relied upon, I guess, as a sort of a cure-all, right? Like we do Challenger, or we do Sandler, or we do whatever, right? Like MedPick, we follow these things, right? But if you take the aggregate of all of that as a sales leader, and just sort of look for, the right behaviors and right indicators within that, then it's like, okay, you can make something out of that. The question I have is that as it pertains to process, one of the questions I always like to ask candidates is, walk me through your sales process, because that, for me, gives me an indication of whether or not they are aligned with whatever the sales leader that I'm recruiting for is looking for, right? Whatever product it is that they're selling. When you're talking to somebody, whether maybe it's even the QBR and you're evaluating their process, or you're interviewing somebody during the interview process, talk to me about what you're listening for as they're walking you through their sales process, and then what are the indicators, one way or the other, to tell you that this person is going to be a good fit, or maybe not. It won't be a good fit.
So, and again, understanding, and you and I have worked intimately with your role as a recruiter, right? And I have a lot of respect for that. And you're talking to a lot of candidates. I guess what I would tell prospective, account executives and sales managing directors is, to me, sales methodology is a common vernacular and a common, framework where we can have high bandwidth conversations about what's happening from lead to close. And so in each of those methodologies, right, Sandler, Spin, Miller Hyman, all of those, they have different, fairly wildly different definitions of the sales stages. What I'm most interested in is, does the person have a logical approach, from, early stage prospecting all the way through proposing and potential proofs of concept and negotiating and closing. And that's where you have to get into very specific examples of some of their more complex deals that they've negotiated. And I do look for people to explain how others in their organization help them, overcome those rebuttals, overcome the challenges, about, giving me a post-mortem on some of their worst losses, as well as, the where, what, how, and why they were successful in certain opportunities. I think that to me, it's about logic and sequence, and leveraging, a process framework, but also being flexible. And so I need them to describe to me, how they have been able to, acquire new leads, whether that came from an inside sales group, or it went to networking events, or it came through, through a website, or it just came through their own networking. I will say, just to pause there for a minute, if I don't believe that a sales candidate is truly a professional networker, I won't hire them. And there's a lot that can be told about people's behavior, even on LinkedIn, where a salesperson that to me just has been able to just leverage either other people's relationships or their own, or really believes that they should be developing, cultivating all these leads at trade shows. I look for evidence of true networking, and that doesn't mean that I think that I only hire for the Rolodex sale. In fact, the Rolodex sale doesn't do me much good in the long run. It's a disposable asset, right? You come through, you plow through your Rolodex, you succeed or you fail, and I'm done with you. And I'm being dramatic for a reason there, right? I would much rather understand that you understand the sales process, a sales process. Can you describe that to me? It doesn't have to be textbook from any purchased methodology, but it does need to, you do need to think about what are all of those steps and stages? Do you ever retrograde any of them? What would you change about the way that you did this in your last couple of roles? And that'll help me understand whether you're really thoughtful about engineering your own effectiveness with sales process.
Yeah, that's what I always say to people too, as well, which is, let's say, for instance, I say Clayton is looking for, someone with a strong sales process, or people that are strategic salespeople, which means you need to follow a process. I think a lot of times people mistake that for thinking that you need them to have one of the named processes or something like that, which isn't the case, right? You need to, the metaphor I always use is, the analogy I guess I always use is that, remember when we were in school, just learning division for the first time, like you're going through that, and they say, show me your work.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, you can't just say, 3 divided by 12 is 4. It's like, you got to show me your work. How did you get to that conclusion, right? Because that shows your logic. It shows that you have a mastering and understanding for what it is, as opposed to just memorizing something like your times tables.
That's right. And I think that these are also people who have to be, you want people who are confident but not cocky, and you want people who understand the value of that process. Again, I'm not overlaying a process on people to micromanage them. I don't have time for that.
Right.
I have no inclination for that. But I do have, when you get pushback saying, I don't want to put my contacts in there, or it's so much work, inputting all of my activity, or it's just let me do my thing, boss. That you have to be able to articulate to them, not because I said so, but because here's the benefit to you. The better the organization understands the sales cycles and the conversion rates and the average deal size, everything we get out of this, the better. If you want me to get you, product enhancements or some sort of sales enablement materials or some marketing, I need to have the data to do that, right? I need to understand what process you've used and where you are with that process, because then I can go to my fellow executives and say, look, I've got this body of evidence that says we need to do account-based marketing here, here, and here. Or this solution, we have a gap right now, and everything in my system of record tells me that we could win. I've got the right people there, right? I've got the right people there. I want to support my people. Whereas if, people who are literally, just kind of smiling and dialing and relying on their charisma to sell, they may not be successful, at least with me, because we expect more, and again, that comes back to teamwork and collaboration, which is a little bit hard to understand. But when you get to know somebody, I said, maybe after a couple of interviews, you get a pretty good sense as to whether they're a lone wolf or they are, and there's a difference between being a lone wolf and being able to operate autonomously. But you want them to be, at least I want them in my organizations, to be highly collaborative, because that's, high tide raises all boats. And, I'm a player coach. I want to roll up my sleeves and get into the field. But I'm only going to do that if I believe that you have checked the boxes along the way to say this opportunity is ready. And if you're not adhering to some sort of a process, then it's difficult to judge that.
Absolutely. And we'll get you out of here on this last question, which is, if someone is interested in joining your team, or frankly, maybe they just want to follow up and ask you direct follow-up questions, or simply just to say thank you, how would they get in touch with you? And also, which position, if you are hiring, which positions are you hiring for, and how should they apply?
We are hiring for a number of positions. I've got, a couple of account executives that I'll be bringing on probably in the second quarter, a few account executives. I'm looking potentially for channel managers. And then we've got a variety of technical positions that are open as well. And those, I think, our recruiting system is it Greenhouse, I believe.
Greenhouse.
So they can find those positions there. Otherwise, they can contact you, Jay, or they can find me on LinkedIn. That's, I'm an avid user of LinkedIn, made a lot of money there, made a lot of good relationships there. Think that it's probably, I don't know if it's was it worth the $28 billion that Microsoft paid for it, but I live there. And it's of critical importance to me. So that would be the best way to get a hold of me. And, if you believe that you're up to the challenge of being, of that Socratic method, and constantly being asked to, what you're going to do today that will make you better than yesterday, but not quite as good as tomorrow, then, reach out to me.
That is Clayton LiaBraaten.
LiaBraaten.
And I'll spell it for you if you're in your car or just, want to find him on LinkedIn, because frankly, that's how I found him. It's Clayton, which is Clayton, LiaBraaten, LiaBraaten.
Right.
He was our guest today over Quota. Thank you, Clayton.
Thanks a lot, Jay. Have a good day.
Goodbye, everybody.